Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining us again for another episode of the LMA Live podcast. This week, I'm joined by a couple of very special guests. One a little bit more special than the other, so I'll start with the lesser one. MP Stephen Lawrence. I'm kidding. And our legal advisor, Majed Kheir. Both
Pleasure to be
very
back.
special guests. I don't rate one more than the other. Not at all. For those of you who are not familiar with Stephen here, just by way of introduction, Stephen is a bush boy from Dubbo, I believe it is.
Yep, I live in Dubbo. I've lived there since 2010, born in Griffith, in fact, but grew up in Wollongong and Sydney, and then moved to Dubbo to work at the Aboriginal Legal Service.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, originally for 1 year, and I'm still there. So.
It's still there. So some things have a way of just pulling you in and sort of keeping you there.
It's true.
He's also a member of New South Wales Labor government and a member of the Legislative Council, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that's correct.
Also a long-time supporter of the Palestinian cause. And by quick way of introduction for Majed is a lawyer. I think he's been practicing for almost a decade now.
Oh, yeah, close to it.
Yep.
Yeah, close to it.
And we consider him the community's legal advisor at this point. I think everyone...
No
and
pressure.
He's busy.
He's
Crazy time.
He's a busy man and possibly going to become more busy quite soon.
Yeah.
So before we get into the softer questions, I want to start with one of the more hard hitting questions. Stephen, how'd you go from a bush boy out in Dubbo, what is it, 6 hours away or something,
Yep.
to marching on the Harbour Bridge as a Palestinian or supporter of the Palestinian cause?
I guess it's a long story, but in 2011, I went to work in Ramallah for 3 months in the West Bank. I did a fellowship there with an American NGO called the International Legal Foundation, which works on establishing, I guess, a public defender sort of system in the West Bank. And I went there with some background knowledge, I guess, about Israel-Palestine, but not a huge amount of it. So living there over the months I was there, I got to know Palestinian people, and in particular the lawyers that I was working with, and got to, I guess, see some of the realities of life there. And once you've been stuck in Columbia checkpoint for 3 hours in an iron cage, once you've in Hebron passed through a military checkpoint and been screamed at, not sure if it was Hebrew or Arabic, but got to the other side. And then the American soldier said to me, "Sorry, man, I thought you were an Arab." After having these experiences, the work car being stoned by settlers, etc., you sort of start to get a sense of the place and form views about it. And I'm very interested in and committed to international law and human rights. So I don't really see myself as kind of pro-Palestinian or pro a particular side or an advocate for a particular side. I just see myself, I guess, as a lawyer and an MP who believes in human rights and international law. And when issues have arisen, particularly issues that affect our civil liberties here and communities here, I've been willing, I guess, to use my voice to speak up at particular times where I thought that I could make a bit of a difference. Yeah.
And have you been back since by any chance?
No, I haven't. And I think from what I read, that I might have problems going back because you enter through Israel.
Yeah.
And it's been well reported that the Israeli authorities, as they're entitled to do, I suppose, they check who's entering their country and apply certain rules. So I think on my arrival in Tel Aviv, when I went there in 2011, I was sort of 6 hours in customs being questioned on the way in.
Oh, wow.
So I think this time, if I went back, I might be turned around. I'm not
Safe
quite
to
sure.
say there's no Tel Aviv branch of the Stephen Lawrence fan club. I don't think
That
there's
could be
many
right.
fans.
Well, there's a diversity of people there, though, so you
Yeah,
never know.
that's right.
One question on this, and I know this is usually something that's asked at the end of podcasts, but let's get it up front while we're sort of on this point. What's the biggest lesson you learned while you were there? What's something that I suppose sticks with you every time you think of that trip?
Look, I went there before I went to Afghanistan. I spent a year in Afghanistan, but after I went to Solomon Islands, where I represented people that had been involved in armed conflict there, former militants and different people. But being in Palestine, which obviously is this very evocative place and name, and the Palestinian people, I guess, in a lot of international narratives, and obviously Israel's done a lot of this, sometimes tarred with the brush of sort of intransigent radicalism. But these are political narratives and media narratives. But what I learned there was that we're actually all pretty similar all around the world. We all want pretty similar things. And I think we're all entitled to the same human rights. So that lesson was brought home to me there, but I learned it in other places too.
Majed, before when we sat down to sort of talk a little bit about this podcast beforehand, you told me that you've met Lawrence before. You guys have Stephen before. You guys have a little bit of a history. How'd that come about, if you don't mind me asking?
So Stephen probably doesn't know, but we've met at least one protest. And Stephen also shared chambers with somebody who's played a very, very important role in my personal career and someone who I consider a mentor, Mahmoud Hawila, who's also a very famous pro-Palestinian advocate who's doing a lot of amazing work both in court and out of court. So Stephen's reputation sort of preceded him as someone who was an ally of the cause and of the community by extension. But to my great misfortune, just as I got to a point where I could finally brief Stephen, he decided to
That would have been good.
abscond, and so I missed out on the opportunity. But nevertheless, we've been extremely privileged to see his advocacy within Parliament, and so taken off out of chambers and out of the courtrooms and into Parliament because, look, I think it's safe to say it's probably needed there just as much, if not more, than anywhere else. So, no, I missed out on the opportunity to brief Stephen, but that's okay. He's doing amazing work nevertheless.
Nice. Okay, Stephen, you are famously a member, I believe, one of the early members of the New South Wales Friends for Palestine. Tell me, what's it like navigating being a part of the Friends for Palestine and sort of the current political climate?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm an early member of it. I don't actually know the exact history, but it definitely existed in the previous parliament, probably before. And Shaket Mosselmani, I know, was extensively involved during his time in the upper house. So not an early member, but definitely like a parliamentary member and definitely a supporter. And I've been a signatory to various statements and assisted in various aspects of the work. And Labor Friends of Palestine is basically like a cross-factional sort of group in the Labor Party. So the Labor Party has factions and LFOP is active across all the factions and basically, I guess, a forum or a group for party members to come together and advocate on issues to do with Palestine.
So do you mind explaining? So what does that mean? Like how does it function? What does that practically look like?
So practically means organising in the party, for example, in the lead up to conferences and the like, where motions about Palestine might be coming before the conference. It also, a very significant part of the work has been issuing public statements and doing media and other advocacy to draw attention on particular issues. So, for example, in the lead up to the trip of the Israeli president to Australia, the LFOP spokespeople, including Peter Moss, have been very active in putting out statements and strongly opposing that visit. So it's a diversity of work, but it ensures that I guess the message is out there in the community that whatever you might think of the particular Labor government, state or federal, its positions on Palestine now or historically, there is a very significant group in the Labor Party that may well have the same view as you and is fighting there for justice on this issue.
How's that feel for you though, Stephen, about, you mentioned about, historical changes that may or may not have occurred, that I think the sentiment within broad swathes of the community, particularly the Muslim community, there seems to be a sense of abandonment, especially when it comes to federal, but also at a state level within New South Wales. And so, does that put you at odds as a member of LFOP and someone who has advocated for stances that the pro-Palestine movement broadly has advocated, that there seems to have been a real shift over the last decade or so towards a more central or neutral position? Is that a difficult sort of conflict to navigate?
Oh, look, it's one of those issues that it's not really for the faint of heart, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
It's an issue that I think a lot of people in politics and in different other areas of endeavour avoid, because it's polarising and it's difficult and there's repercussions sometimes. So there's definitely been points in my parliamentary career where I've been at odds with the leadership on particular aspects of it. But I don't find that personally difficult because I approach it like I try to approach, I guess, all issues, which is I think through my position, it's informed normally by values that I've had a pretty long standing, and I don't tend to adopt strong public positions unless I've thought about it and I'm comfortable in taking those positions. But yeah, I hear what you say about a sense of alienation. And I think one of the things of late with the Palestine protest movement, for example, and positions that the state government has taken is that a lot has been read into particular positions that the state government and the Premier has taken. But the reality of state government is responsible for law enforcement, for community safety, for roads, for all sorts of things. And I suspect that if there was a raging political movement in Australia at the moment for a fundamental change of position, let's say on China and Tibet or something of that nature, hundreds of thousands of people pouring into the streets, regular street protests down main streets of the CBD, I think the Premier and the government would have similar views to the ones that have been expressed. But a lot has been read into those positions in terms of the underlying issue of Israel-Palestine, which is so important to so many communities. So I would just say that I would sort of urge people to obviously people are going to form their own view, but don't necessarily read into things that are being said about community safety issues and road use issues and things like that. Don't necessarily read in an underlying view on the issue, because it's more likely to be a view driven by other considerations relating to the responsibilities of state government.
I could totally understand that. I could totally understand that the state government has responsibilities to its citizens to try to keep them safe and make sure that there's no crowd crush and things like that.
Yeah.
However, and I suppose it's going to lead into our next set of questions. I feel like we've seen has been this public jewel almost of, and political safety is almost used as a veneer to push back on the sentiments of people, right? and allowing them to express those sentiments in the most loudest of ways, whether it's here in Sydney or in New South in Victoria, where Victoria was. The Victorian government famously said that it's cost them so many millions of dollars to manage these protests. It almost seems like they haven't there's this pushback directly on the fact that it is the cause that is the issue, right? We could go into a bit more detail, but what would you say to that?
Look, I think if you, for example, go through the Premier's public statements, I honestly think this, you will struggle to find a lot that you can disagree with on the underlying issue. Now,
so what do you mean by that, if you don't mind me asking?
He hasn't, by and large, tried to express opinions about the underlying issue.
Okay.
The underlying issue of Israel-Palestine and the rights and wrongs of that and which side sort of he's on or whatever. Sure. His comments and his positions, and this is true, I think, of various other people as well, it's not just about the Premier, But the positions that have been taken in respect to, for example, should a particular protest go ahead. Now, the Premier's view on the Harbour Bridge protest, and I disagreed with that at the time, so I'm not defending his position in terms of the underlying issue of that protest. But the position he took was very much premised on a view that he took about safety, and also a view that he took about the convenience of the city and so forth. Now, reasonable minds can differ on those things, and I would also accept that underlying sort of political views might influence views on things like that. But I guess what I'm saying is give, to the community in terms of the Labor Party and particular things that have occurred, give us the benefit of the doubt, because it's a very big thing to be charged with responsibility for public safety and so forth. And it's very different, I know, when people are in those supreme positions of responsibility. They really are weighing considerations that I'm not weighing when I'm expressing my views about things, and that certainly people in the community aren't weighing when they're participating in things. So I think we have to try to give each other the benefit of the doubt to some extent, see the position of the other, try to think about what they're taking into account. But I'd say this as well, not to think that I'm totally avoiding the issue. We live in a country that, if you look internationally, is pretty much an outlier on the question of Palestine. Like, we recognised Palestine recently, and, people sort of carried on like we're the greatest supporters of the Palestinians ever as a consequence. The vast majority of the world, or certainly the majority of the world, sort of did that in the 1980s or 90s, I think. So we do live in a country that is an outlier on this issue, and that affects the narratives, it affects the politics, which then bleeds into all these other issues. I certainly don't deny that.
Majed, did you have anything to add? Or
Yeah, I mean, look, I think anyone could accept or appreciate that leadership in general, but in particular in the world of politics, whether it's at the state or federal level, comes with a significant weight that I can imagine would weigh on anyone's mind and shoulders, and it's a heavy weight to carry. I think that on the issues of that have arisen around protests, I think it's understandable to accept that there are surrounding issues, things like road safety, convenience, but in terms of how that's interpreted and the community sort of accepting that it's these aesthetics or convenience that's really being considered, is some of the rhetoric that's come, and that sort of paints the picture for how the community takes that whether it's criticism or counterpoints, particularly from the Premier himself, and so the commentary around it has sort of painted an additional picture and allowed or sort of created a circumstance where the community reads between the lines and fills in the gaps, which I think is entirely understandable. So I think probably the biggest lightning rod from the perspective of the Muslim community that's arisen at the state level was, I mean, obviously the protest laws, which have reverberated around the broader community, but some of the language around phrases like the Intifada or commentary around Palestinian resistance more generally. So I think, I absolutely accept the point that protests, while protesting is a very essential right and liberty that we enjoy, there are other considerations for government to take into account. But I certainly do see the community perspective of reading between the lines and saying there's a bit more to it than that. I think there's enough there on the public record, in particular over the last 4 weeks since the tragedy at Bondi, for the community to feel like there might be a bit more going on.
And should those considerations be really, at the end of the day, should they be a factor or that bigger factor in stopping people's free speech, stopping, wanting to hold back or wanting to limit people's civil liberties effectively? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a balancing act. I think that's what what it comes down to, right? So how do you balance that? We say, okay, well, protest is a very essential right. It shouldn't be impinged upon, but then there are a few different competing perspectives. I guess there's this competing perspective of psychosocial safety or social cohesion and hate speech and all of that stuff that's come up, and then also how do protests impact the bottom line of the state budget, like making sure that it's financially viable, and things like convenience. So where does it weigh that balancing act? How?
The nature of protest is that they're supposed to be inconvenient.
It's disruptive.
They're supposed to be disruptive. You know, I suppose the one thing in a country like Australia is that they're limited in their practice because you've got the state and the people sort of working together to allow for a space for that to happen. Right? In other countries, we've seen they just flood the streets, and it is what it is, and what happens may be. So like to be pushing so ferociously against people's willingness to go out and create that disruption for their for a cause that they deeply care about, you could see very easily why people read between the lines that it's more than just a veneer of public safety or whatever it may be.
Yeah, look, there's a whole lot of issues there. I agree it's a balancing act, and it's definitely a balancing act in the summary offences regime, where in New South Wales you can effectively seek an approval of a certain type for a protest. It's not really an approval, it's just an immunity from certain offences relating to the use of roads. But to the extent it's a balancing act, because it's also an implied freedom of political communication in terms of the constitutional test. But to the extent it's a balancing act, I mean, there's a really important question about what goes into the balance.
Yeah.
And, one of the things I really took issue with after Bondi was the suggestion that the lawful, peaceful Palestine movement in Australia had contributed to that.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't accept that. And I can think of a lot of examples, and Christchurch certainly comes to mind, where in the aftermath of Christchurch, some similar criticisms were made of the right of politics.
Yep.
People, for example, were suggesting that people that had advocated against immigration, people that had said things against the Islamic community of different types, people that had really focused on terrorism as an issue and in some sense caused sort of harm to the reputation of parts of the community as a consequence, that somehow they were responsible for Christchurch. And at the time, I didn't accept that reasoning, because some conduct is so grotesque and such an outlier in terms of human behaviour that it is almost, I think, ethically challenging to even think about a causative connection from lawful, peaceful activity.
Yeah.
So I don't accept that that is something that really should go into the balance. But lots of things go into the balance, including the convenience of the community, including in respect of street protests, the fact that there is in respect of roads generally, a pretty low-level criminal offence that applies to obstruction of roads and the like, so you need immunity from that.
Yep.
But look, the point that I made after the Harbour Bridge protest in different media was, at a certain point, in the face of a certain array of circumstances, in the face of a volume of people who want to protest, it ceases to be the role of the state to obstruct that. It becomes the role of the state to facilitate that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I worry, and this is not a commentary on any particular provision that's passed into law in the last 3 years necessarily, but what I fear is that this slow and steady constriction of the right to protest is sort of taking us back to the 1970s. And in 1978, there was a police riot as a consequence of a protest.
Yep.
A lot of laws got, in the aftermath of that, repealed. There was an acceptance that the regime was draconian. It actually had caused that riot. And I fear that we're sort of drifting back to that. So these are things that need to be carefully thought about.
If you clamp down tight enough, eventually there's a blowback, and the community. I mean, when you're living in a country like Australia, where it's so important and central to the political culture, the community values so heavily their liberties. It's and I think we were having this discussion last week as well, that there's almost a risk that by forcing certain aspects of the community underground in an effort to limit their impact,
Yeah.
whether it's through protest or in the online sphere or hate speech, it can actually exacerbate it because it becomes unregulated. And I think that's a conversation that occurs in a variety of different areas. Like, for example, there's a massive argument, at least at the federal level, around things like cannabis or drug testing. And so it's about when things are legalized or when things are regulated, there's much more safety and security. And then once you clamp down tight enough, there's the risk of forcing those elements underground where you don't know what they're up to and what they're doing, and then B, eventually the community becomes so constricted or restricted that they feel that there's no choice but to protest in a way that may be much more violent or dangerous than the way that they have been previously. And I think I think I'd have to mention, like, for example, the weekly protests at Hyde Park or around the CBD. I think there were something in excess of 90 straight Sundays where protests occurred, probably less than a dozen charges, no public health incidents of note. But it is, I can understand a difficult balancing act. But like I say, yeah, the commentary around it has coloured the community's perspective, I guess. And in particular, I think when it comes to phrases that hold cultural or religious significance.
Yeah. So I was going to ask about this. Sorry, Majed. I was going to jump on this. So another part of the protest is the speech that's used and deployed in those protests, which has been vastly demonized over the last few weeks, last couple of months, even before then. Phrases like, and you know, there's no hiding it. There's no getting around it, right? Chris Minns came out and famously said, look, we don't have the same laws around speech as the United States, right? You know, if we're going to accept that speech causes problems in other places, right? Excuse the paraphrasing, you know, then it's going to cause problems here. And, you know, when a hate preacher gets up and, you know, speaks, you don't know what forces you're unleashing. Like all language which is well and truly demonizing those protests and what's being said at those protests, even though there are people of the Jewish faith at those protests. There are you know, allies of the Palestinian movement, you know, who are of the Jewish faith. So effectively, there's language that's been focused on and has been demonized, and now is being looked at as outlawed, or you know, would want the government wants to outlaw those laws. Why is it that speech has been picked on and not other speech, such as phrases like globalize the intifada? Can still say that, it's legal. Is picked on. However, a phrase like Amalek has not been picked on, or hasn't been used as a phrase or example of hate speech.
I mean, I think attention has been drawn to particular Palestinian slogans in part because of the size and the frequency of the protest movement. But it's also, attention has been drawn to these things also because a theory has been advanced that, and I think the analogy is made with a triangle where acts of violence are at the top, speech is at the bottom. And, you know, this suggestion has been made that slogans like globalise the intifada are sort of the speech at the bottom, and that they somehow contribute to things at the top, which I think it's a theory that needs to be thought about, and I think it's a theory that needs to be critiqued, and it's a theory in respect of which evidence has to be sort of sought and analysed. And as someone who has studied genocide at a postgraduate level, it sort of resonates with some of the theories of the steps of genocide, and the idea that language of dehumanisation, for example, is a sort of step on the stages of genocide. But this theory in respect of things like globalise the intifada being said in Sydney 2023, 4, 5, whatever.
It wasn't even a famous phrase in and of itself. Globalise the intifada, as far as I knew, only really was an issue in the United States when Mamdani was running for his mayoralship.
It was certainly raised in that context, yeah. But look, I'm not convinced that phrase is part of that triangle that leads to violence, I must say. And look, in respect of globalised intifada, as you've said, it hasn't, as I understand it, been sort of used much, if at all. And I saw Josh Lees on TV the other night, one of the Palestine Action Group leaders, saying that they had not chanted it. And I do remember on the Harbour Bridge the chanting of "Long live the Intifada," but I certainly don't recall "Globalise the Intifada." So look, that theory I think is one it's sort of a convenient theory if you're making a particular argument. It sort of resonates, I think, with some accepted theories of violence, but personally I don't buy it. This is a matter that will probably come before the Labor caucus because there's been talk about legislation. But look, certain members of the caucus have spoken out and put their opinions, so I feel that I'm able to do it. I would never have understood the phrase "globalise the Intifada" to be a call for violence, or certainly not a call for violence here in Australia. My understanding of it is that it's an Arabic word that means shake off or uprising. It's used as a word for revolution or uprising. But to the extent that I've been aware of such phrases being chanted in protests around the world, I would have thought what it's really intended to mean is spread the Palestinian support movement around the world, because international pressure is ultimately what will lead to change over there. That's been my sort of understanding.
Awareness. And I think we discussed that last week, that I think I described it as like it's just like a mass gaslighting of the community, in my opinion, about the framing around the connection or alleged connection between pro-Palestinian protests and the tragedy that occurred in Bondi about a month ago. And there were two things that stood out to me about that framing that I found so abhorrent. The first was, and we had a chuckle about this last week, that many people within the Muslim community find literally laughable the suggestion that people like the individuals who carried out that attack were somehow inspired or motivated or connected to the Palestinian movement, because we know within the Muslim community and being somewhat aware of the ideology that these people are motivated by, that
it's not about Palestinian nationalism.
Well, no, and that's exactly right. And Jamel, who was sitting on the podcast, said they hate us, like as in Muslims who would find themselves in those environments, like the Harbour Bridge protest, possibly more than they hate the people that they shot at. Like it's insane to suggest that they were in any way motivated by it, because they probably hate those freedoms. They probably hate the diversity at those sorts of events. And then the second part of it was the connections started to be made possibly within hours, but at the very least 24 hours later, the first media and political commentary started making that link. And I think you'd be able to give some insight onto it, because I was talking about it from a legal perspective and saying there's just no way possible, where charges weren't laid until a week later, that you knew enough about the ideology, the religion, the motivations of these people to possibly be able to make that link. I mean, even now, I think it's 5 weeks now.
I mean, I think one needs to be careful though, right? Because there was something in the police fact sheet, for example, talking about a video that the two terrorists made where they talked about wanting to kill Zionists, apparently.
Yeah.
So someone might infer from that somehow that's a connection to the Palestine movement, for example.
Yeah.
Now, you can imagine a lot of movements, and there is a lot of movements around the world, where there is some extreme group linked to the movement in the sense that they, in some general sense, have the same cause.
Yeah.
So, for example, and this was talked about in the Parliament by Anthony Diadam, my colleague, the pro-life movement in America is a massive movement consisting almost exclusively of, peaceful people who don't believe in abortion. Then there's a tiny minority who go around and kill abortion doctors.
Or firebomb.
Are we to blame pro-life protesters and sort of demonstrators for the actions of that tiny minority? I think most people overwhelmingly would say no. The fact that they exist and the fact that there could be some crossover. Now here, I don't know if there's crossover, But let's say on a sort of worst case scenario that those people had attended a protest or have some material on their phones expressing support for Palestine. I still, to go back to what I said at the beginning, some actions are such moral and behavioural outliers that any suggestion of causative connection, I think, is broken. And one needs to, with a sense of moral clarity, call out that sort of conduct for what it is, and it is not connected to lawful and peaceful protests.
There's a bit of cruel irony in the discussion, because I think the Muslim community found ourselves in on the flip side of the discussion back in 2019 when the Christchurch terror attack happened, and I think many within the Muslim community felt as though, I believe that was during Scott Morrison's prime ministership, and there was all the reports coming out that he had allegedly may or may not have said, Islamophobia should be weaponized or should be used as part of an election strategy, and that was a really trying time for the Muslim community, because there was a bit of a leadership spill. So Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison seemed like they were both in a race to the bottom when it came to Islamophobia, and so following Christchurch, there was a feeling within the Muslim community that, look, there are people who have made it very clear they want to be known as part of their election strategy as either enemies or at the very least not supporters of the Muslim community and immigration from Muslim countries. And so many within the Muslim community felt like, no, this was part of the environment and the ecosystem. Like there was a pressure cooker effect that was happening from about the early 2010s when ISIS first emerged, all the way up until Christchurch, where it felt like the pressure was just building and the hatred was just...
I would say the pressure cooker started in 2001, if not earlier.
Yeah, the first iteration of it, like the War on Terror version, and then you had the ISIS version, and it keeps evolving. And now we've got quite possibly a completely new brand of it coming post Bondi of the like Islamophobic war on terror that constantly evolves. But it's like I said, there's a cruel irony, because I think many, including myself, in the Muslim community felt like, no, you had Fraser Anning in Parliament at the time, who said some of the most, I think, possibly the most insane publication ever published on a federal parliament letterhead that came out after Christchurch. And so
he was a very extreme
and so I think,
and I should say this, I mean, he basically set up a political party that in its symbols and so forth seemed to resonate with a certain German political party.
Under the current legislation,
and he got 0.0 what % of the vote. So
that's right.
The ultimate guarantee in respect of those sorts of extremisms is, I think, the good judgment, decency of people.
Exactly, but like I said, like we can see where, for example, if the Jewish community says, look, we feel like this was something that was created by the political climate, like I said, there's a cruel irony, because we feel that may lend itself to a genuine argument, but then at the same time, it just goes back to the seemingly never-ending discussion, both in politics, in court, most recently in the federal court in the Haddad v. Wertheim defamation proceedings about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism and all that stuff. But I only think that there is a cruel irony to it, that we've seen both sides of it over the few years, and it just seems to shift back and forth every few years.
I mean, I think one salient difference is the suggestion that any particular political leader or thought leader in respect of, matters pertaining to Islam was directly responsible for Christchurch. I don't recall that being asserted by senior political leaders as a matter of indisputable fact.
No.
So certainly there was some community level stuff, and people were thinking that. But what occurred in the aftermath of Bondi, I think, was very, very different.
But Bondi was one of those things that, and I've said it for a long time, I said it ever since it happened, if anybody resonated with what happened in Bondi, it was the Muslim community. I took a flight not long when Christchurch happened. It was probably the first time my wife had ever seen me cry. I got home from work and it was like this really weird moment in time. Luckily, I was able to take a flight to Christchurch a day after to sort of do a little bit of work there with the community and for an outlet over in the UK. And like it really sort of, like it all just came back, all those memories came back of, the aftermath, how I felt, how I could imagine, people who were there, people who have families there, felt. And then a couple of days later, I remembered that I actually have a friend that lived out that way as well. So, reach out to him just to see how he's doing and whatnot. It's one of those moments in time that the sad thing about the whole thing, the saddest part about the whole Bondi situation was how quickly it became politicized. There was no time to actually just get together and talk or heal or any of that.
Straight
I don't want to get into the deeper politics of it, but it was almost 2 days later, and we're talking about introducing the IHRA definition of. It's like, can we slow down for just a moment? I do want to go to a quick question that we have from one of our viewers, and then move into some of the other parts of the discussion. So online, one of our viewers, Jamal, asks, what was your position on the use of the Opera House by the government to light up the Israeli flag? And then the language of the Premier straight after that saying they had taken the Opera House back as if it was ever, taken over or used for its own, sort of occupied in any sense. How did you feel about that, and how do you feel that sort of commentary contributes to the wider narrative and the sense that of people who are directly affected by the Israel-Palestine sort of situation?
Look, I think it's one of those, decisions or events that everyone viewed it through their own lens or their own prism. It was something that was done very quickly after October 7, and there's absolutely no doubt that very grave crimes against humanity, if you want to use the language of international law, occurred in October 7 or during that event, and that it was a mass killing on a very significant to a very significant degree on a particular day. So that is what motivated lighting up the Opera House. But what we saw after that, and I suppose during that whole incident, is such fundamentally different ways of understanding October 7, of understanding why it occurred and what the context was of it. Now, none of that, except among the extreme fringes, I would suggest, took away from collective condemnation of the killing of civilians. And I think that's an incredibly important thing to highlight. Like, everyone acknowledged that things that occurred there were totally unacceptable.
But I suppose what it lends itself to is this wider, deeper sort of situation, and those who are pro the Palestinian cause kind of, yes, they condemn the killing of civilians, but at the same time they see it in this more complicated way of, this place is it's the world's biggest open air prison, as I think Jimmy Carter had put it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's like almost a sense of we've broken through a little bit, and then to almost have the state come in and say, we're going to take a specific position on this complicated issue that we know is going to deeply hurt many of our citizens. At least I would hope the state knows that. Almost feels in many ways tone deaf.
I think the intention, or my view is the intention was to mark the mass death on one day of so many people. Now, as it was responded to,
would there be more appropriate ways to do, like for some, the flag is representative of a colonial settler colonial state. Is there a more appropriate or sort of sensitive sort of way, not to get too woke about it or too soft about it, right? But could that have been handled better?
Yeah, look, I'm very outspoken on many aspects of this issue, right? If I think that civil liberties are being trespassed, then I've spoken up about that in the past, and I've been very forthright about my views generally on the Palestinian situation. But I have never actually been publicly critical of that decision because I sort of give the benefit of the doubt, to people generally, and I know what the Premier's intention was with it, which was to mark so many civilians dying on one day in one place.
Sure.
Now, it happened in Israel. The majority of the deaths were Israeli, a variety of Israelis as well. There was Palestinians killed, there was Thai workers killed, there was a significant degree of sort of indiscriminateness about it. So I give him the benefit of the doubt on that, and it's not a decision that I would second guess and sort of criticise. And I guess I'd go back to the things I said at the beginning, which is, I know how emotive this is, I know how sensitive it is, but try and sort of see it from the perspective of the other. Try to give the benefit of the doubt to the extent you can. Mm-hmm. And that's what I do in respect of that decision. Sure. And this is not me trying to make excuses or shy away, because I've been publicly critical on various different things. I'm willing to be critical. Yeah. I've got strong views about it, but I really don't want to second guess the sort of bona fides of that kind of decision, because I actually think that's what the intention was.
Sure.
Yeah, but I understand what you're saying, and I'm sympathetic to what you're saying about how it's interpreted and received. I really am.
I think the biggest contention that arose from it, just on like communicating with members of our community, wasn't so much that specifically in isolation the Israeli flag had been portrayed. I think what it felt, and this goes back to what we were saying about alienation, the most common argument or gripe, for lack of a better word, was, well, hang on a minute, it was 1,400, I think 1,456 deaths, if I've got the number right, something in that region, right, that were killed on that day. And then there was discussion about how many of them were militants. The point is, a lot of people were killed. Yeah. So that what you're saying about it being an understandable decision maybe would have gone down a lot better were it not for the fact that many people contended, well, hang on a minute, we could go back over the last 80 years of Israel-Palestine history, and there were days and weeks where massacres of that scale or even larger had occurred, the Nakba in 48, and at no point did the discussion ever occur that Australia or New South Wales at a state or federal level should recognise those tragedies. I
mean, I totally agree with what you're saying.
And I think
it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is everything that I'm sort of saying about some of these issues, I'm also trying to surround that with the observation that we live in an outlier country.
Yeah.
Like, we live in a country where the dominant narrative on Israel and Palestine is totally imbalanced.
Do you think it comes from...
This is the surrounding context for a lot of things, because the media is selective.
Yeah.
As human beings, we're selective. Our empathy is selective. It's conditioned by a whole lot of different things. And yeah, when Sabra and Shatila happened, I don't think anyone said, let's light up the Opera House.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's the community centre. Yeah. Even Janine, there were so many. And so...
But this is not, I don't think, a criticism that you can really usefully make of... I mean, you can, but I think if you're going to make it of an individual politician...
No.
This is a broader issue that relates back to geopolitics and relates back to a whole lot of different things.
It's just that general feeling of frustration that, how ready the community, government and media were to recognise the tragedy of innocent lives being lost in that context, when many people, and I mean, you were part of the movement of fighting for human rights for Palestinians long before that, right? So, and many people like yourself had been advocating for awareness about it for so long, and it was so hard to, it's always been very hard to get traction in the mainstream of politics and media and the community say, like, look at this, care about this. I think generally the feeling is we're a very lucky country, and so we're always hesitant, in my view, to import problems elsewhere, because we are so lucky to live in such a great place that's generally so peaceful, notwithstanding what happened in Bondi and other outliers. But then we saw like such a big shift. It was like all of a sudden people took a great interest in this tragedy. Why? I'd be interested to know why you think it was so much easier for people in politics, media, and society generally to feel the sympathy. And it's not critical of how they felt, but more just a genuine wondering of how do we get to that state, that level with the Palestinian cause, and have that same level of sympathy and care.
I mean, I think that's a really complex question. And I think there's issues of race and culture and geopolitics in there, and things that relate to how the media operates, language, what do we see ourselves as having in common, what is our overall relationship with Israel as opposed to our relationship with the Palestinians. I think these things all relate to what our imagined communities are. And Palestine, by and large, in respect of the Australian community, is not part of an imagined community that we see ourselves in.
Yeah.
But I think that's changing. And I think in the last 3 years, we've seen this incredible movement, which it's occurring because of concrete demands around foreign policy. You know, like the recognition of Palestine, for example, has been a key demand. That's now happened very significantly, I think, impacted by the Harbour Bridge protest. So the Australian people have been mobilising. I think the Palestine movement has made great strides, and the situation over there is really urgent, and the backlash here is really strong, and the consequences for our civil liberties is really huge. So this is a really important issue that is not going away.
Is there actually, I'll move on to the just a couple questions that I have still on this point, because I really want to get onto the laws. And I'm sure we can go on for hours just on this point alone. So two really, really quick questions. The first one is, we know that we have, Jewish people from Jewish background who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. You've got the Jewish Council and others. However, it seems like certain voices are the strongest, are the ones that generally have the government's ear. So my question is, how does the government, especially New South Wales government, ensure that it doesn't treat the Jewish community as a monolith community, and it takes on all those voices?
Look, it's incredibly important, and I recently sat on the anti-Semitism inquiry, which is ongoing at the moment, and we took evidence in person and in submissions from heaps of Jewish people, many not of a Zionist perspective, many of a Zionist perspective, and they well demonstrated how diverse the Jewish community is. It's incredibly important that it is not presented as a monolith for a number of reasons. One, that it belies the diversity and the diversity of political perspectives if you do it, but also because one of the central theories underpinning anti-Semitism is this idea of Jewish power. This idea of Jewish power, this conspiracy theory, relies on the idea that the Jewish community is a monolith. This has been an anti-Semitic trope. So it's incredibly important, I think, in trying to push back and unpick anti-Semitism, that we don't present the Jewish community as a monolith. I think it's also really important that we don't present the Jewish community as integrally linked to and therefore responsible in the minds of irrational people for the actions of Israel. And that's not to take away at all from strong bonds that exist between Jewish people and Israel. That's not going away.
Specifically in a religious context.
Yep, it's not going away. It shouldn't be expected to go away. And in the inquiry, the evidence we took was that the significant majority of Australian Jewish people are sort of Zionist in perspective. That is absolutely their right. It is no basis to inflict persecution on them that they're of a Zionist perspective. So this is critical in letting the pro-Palestine voices be heard, but I think it's also incredibly significant in terms of acting upon anti-Semitism.
And just the second question, sort of just leading on from that, and I do apologize, I don't mean for this question to come across as anti-Semitic, but what we've sort of felt or seen over the last couple of years is that there are a multitude of voices. I'm sure the government is taking in many of those voices. However, then, a lot of the time, at least from our perspective, a specific voice tends to be dominant or tends to sort of get its way, right? So And to be quite direct and honest, many of us may feel that it's because of the influence of the Zionist lobbies on politicians, on the government, donations that go through. What would you say to that sort of claim?
Look, as a politician, I've actually sort of for the first time in my life been exposed to lobbyists, so I can talk about this a little bit.
And one thing, sorry, just while it sort of comes back to mind, one thing that many in sort of the pro-Palestinian sort of movement would point at are things like, I can't remember the exact name that they give to these trips, but young
Junkets.
politicians are sent over to Israel
junkets.
to visit, and then there's like this deep history sort of just built with that politician, and it seems like its utility comes out in times like these.
Yeah, look, on this question of lobby, I mean, I think it's overstated, right, significantly. I don't think the degree of alliance, if you like, I don't think it's a formal alliance, but I don't think the degree of linkage between Australia and Israel is because of a lobby or a secret lobby. And people are entitled to lobby, and I meet with a whole range of different groups who would fall within this idea of lobbyist if you apply the definition that's applied to the Jewish community. Because I think when people talk about the idea of a kind of Jewish lobby, and I'm loath to use it, they're talking about like the Board of Deputies, they're talking about AJAC, sort of different groups. Lots of different communities have similar organisations. Every community is entitled to do that. And I do think we need to be careful when we talk about those sort of concepts, because it can drift into some sort of anti-Semitic kind of trope, particularly to people who might be listening to it. But, by the same token, when groups are trying to influence government and other groups don't agree with what that group's trying to get government to do, then people are entitled to say, look, what you're being told is not right and we disagree with it. But yeah, I don't think fundamentally this is about the power of a particular lobby. I think it's about political choices that politicians, senior people in the media and other people are making. And those choices are conditioned by those broader things that we were talking about before, right? The culture, the geopolitical alliances, issues of race and religion and sort of commonality and connection. So this is a whole sort of complex thing that I think to reduce it to the power of a lobby, I don't think it sort of does justice to just how complex it is. And I've met various representatives of Jewish organisations, and in my dealings with them, they've just put their position. And, they've often put it well. And, by the same token, I've met with representatives of the Muslim community, Islamic leaders and all sorts of different people who put their position well as well. So I think it's more complex than a lobby. I think we need to be careful in the language, but we also have to talk about things that are real and important. And I think that's exactly what you're doing.
So you get pulled. Obviously, in politics, everyone knows that particularly the government of the day is getting pulled in so many different directions when there are so many competing political interests. And then over the last 2 years, the real lightning rod for all of that interest has been Israel-Palestine. Would you say, because I genuinely love to get your perspective on this, given all of the criticism that's come towards the Labor Party from traditionally safe Labor communities, like the Muslim community. What would be your view on the assertion that it may be more politically convenient, forgetting about lobbying, but more from a political perspective, particularly going up to in the lead up to elections? Because we've had, I think, both a federal and a state election since 7 October. So those issues were live in both those elections. Do you think it is more politically convenient at times to adopt positions that are seemingly in support of Israel and Australia strengthening its relationship with Israel? So that's nothing to do with lobbies, but just more from a voter base.
I mean, I think there's probably a sort of elephant in the room in that respect, which is News Limited.
Yeah, that's
I mean, you cannot ignore the fact that we've got a very significant media conglomerate which has outlets across different forms of media who basically are completely one-sided, completely extreme, and completely partial and completely sort of campaign orientated in respect of this issue. And they put pressure on any government to take a particular position, and they're noisy and they're troublesome, and they'll cause problems for government.
And
So
they almost decide these elections.
it's a
given
very
their
significant
influence.
driver in Australian politics. There's no doubt about that.
Is it that powerful? Like I almost look at some of these outlets like, legacy media, and who still reads newspapers almost, right? Maybe that's just the coming from someone who's millennial or whatever. Are these news outlets, the Australian News Limited, that powerful in the media space?
I don't think they're powerful in a direct sense, in the sense of the large majority of Australians are not necessarily watching them. They can't necessarily switch a large amount of votes in an instant. But what they can do is apply scrutiny and pressure and create narratives that then continue on. So to say that News Limited is not impactful in Australian politics, I don't think is right, even though sometimes their impact is sort of indirect and over time. But yeah, this campaign that they're running on Israel, which is so unbelievably one-sided, I think it's a factor that you need to consider when you're thinking about the choices that politicians are making, because it would be beyond naive and ridiculous to suggest that politicians don't make political choices.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to Murdoch media. Yeah, I think like I hear what Bilal's saying. Like, there's been a generational shift, and there's been so much back and forth about TikTok and social media, and then the ban, which the federal government recently imposed, and how that's going to impact how young people get their news. But yeah, over an extended period of time, it certainly seems like from a community perspective, the Murdoch media can really not decide an election, whether it's a state or federal, but can create enough pressure and scrutiny, or drum up a drama for the government of the day that could really tip the scale, especially when, like, you look at the last federal elections, and I mean, I wouldn't say it was on a knife edge, but where independents are rising, and so the major parties may really look to get that advantage that might get them over the line.
You also can't ignore News Limited, right? So the time you must spend responding to their campaigns is time that you're not spending on something else.
Yeah.
So I think they influence politics in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to the laws, and I'm conscious of time. So in 60 seconds or less, Stephen, what are your thoughts on new hate laws?
So you talk about the federal hate laws?
The federal hate laws.
Look, I think the new regime for the banning of hate groups is really problematic. I think the thresholds are too low and too subjective. I think if it survives constitutional challenge, which I'm not quite sure if it will, we're creating, I fear, an authoritarian framework. I trust the Albanese government, how it will use it. I think they'll be circumspect and cautious in what they do. I can't say the same thing of future governments because I don't know who they'll be.
Well, I mean, it's worrisome if you're looking at the current. I mean, they disbanded, but the current opposition, it scares me to.
So by current opposition, do you mean One Nation?
The
Liberals or the Nationals? Which one do you mean?
I mean, after seeing that parliamentary, the debates that happened, many were commenting that the first hate speech group to disband was the Libs and
the coalition,
the coalition itself.
Yeah.
So
we spoke about those thresholds on episode 1, and I completely echo your sentiments. One thing that I was talking about, and that I'd love to get your comment on, is about some of the retrospective powers. And I was sort of trying to explain to viewers in no uncertain terms how rare of a step that is for Parliament to take, and how scary it is, because there is really this fundamental principle that's always been around for centuries, that the law needs to be known. That the populations have a right to know what they can and cannot do. And then when we start retrospectively applying norms of what is allowed and what isn't allowed, it's very dangerous territory. And so it does seem to be as that retrospectivity within the law does seem to be really purposeful. And there were two groups that were constantly named in the lead up to the bill, and then the bill eventually passing. That it was all surrounding these two groups.
Yeah, they've had some good advertising.
Yeah, they both
yeah.
have. Yeah, and I
And
think one of them is disbanded now. The NSN, from what's been reported, that they're no longer around. But
I
do you?
assume that they would have rebadged.
Well,
maybe.
yeah, exactly, and that was the argument we were making earlier in our conversation about driving certain groups underground, and whether that's even a scarier prospect. But do you see that retrospectivity within the new law as something of concern?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's a strong presumption against retrospective criminal laws, as you've sort of intimated in your question. This isn't quite a retrospective criminal law because it's
Groups,
it's,
not
it's,
individuals.
it's a norm of behaviour, i.e. the prescription of a group, as
Yeah.
you've said, that can rely upon previous behaviour. But, you know, that's a sort of elusive distinction in a sense, because once a group is proscribed, and that can be on the basis of previous conduct, there's then various very serious criminal penalties for being involved in it.
Yeah.
I suppose what the opposing argument might say is, well, you can be banned based on your retrospective conduct, but you can then choose at that point, at the
Withdraw.
point of declaration, to withdraw from the group, and you won't be the subject of any criminal allegation.
But
So that kind of addresses that a little bit. But the fundamental issue is, for the first time, really, except I suppose in respect of outlaw motorcycle groups, the Communist Party and terrorist groups, for the first time, apart from those, we're going to ban political groups in Australia.
Yeah.
And it's legislation that's at large. It's got very wide criteria. It relies on subjective ideas such as hate, which I know what hate means. You know what hate means. You know what hate means. We probably don't have the same exact idea of hate in all our minds. And this was one of the reasons why the former Chief Justice, Tom Bathurst, as part of the Law Reform Commission, recommended against hate speech laws in New South Wales, because he said you're importing into the criminal law such subjective motions that the criminal law will struggle to fairly administer laws based on those notions. But the New South Wales offence, for example, is now one of the offences that, if the minister believes that you've committed it, you can now be subject to the banning of the group. So, yeah, we're moving into very uncharted waters, I think, and it'll be interesting to see what the High Court does, because there's no doubt about this. This is a very, very serious burden on
You
political.
might have left the bar at the wrong time for
Yeah,
constitutional
yeah.
law.
It's going to be a big year for the implied freedom, I think.
from what you've seen, is it unconstitutional?
I don't know. I'm pretty interested in the separation of powers aspect of it. I appeared in Alexander.
It almost just while you're the separation of powers. It's, for me anyway, and this is, I'm no legal mind I'm no brilliant mind by any stretch of
You're
the
selling yourself
imagination.
short below.
I think you are.
It almost seems like this law makes the government, or of the day, judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah.
And that's really, really sort of worrisome. It's there are some fail safes in there that will tell the opposition, and will tell this person or that person, but those fail safes are quite flimsy.
And the clauses are very clear about not requiring procedural fairness, which is always another extraordinary step that we don't often see in the drafting of legislation, that we're explicitly saying there's no requirement to be procedurally fair, particularly to the groups who may suffer the consequence, and their members who may suffer the consequences of their prescription. But I think noting that time is an issue. One thing that we didn't get a chance to discuss last time, and that I really wanted to get your view on, was the upcoming potential visit of the Israeli president. And your government recently enacted new laws that have been deemed anti-protest laws. I probably agree with that description of them, given that there seems to be an impingement, or at the very least a restriction on our right to protest. There's banned periods, banned locations and things like that. We could see a situation where the ban that's been in place over the last few weeks gets extended. I think it's by the Commissioner of Police who makes that decision.
Yeah, and the minister has to agree with it.
Yeah, and so the Commissioner and the Minister may say, the political climate is still so volatile that we need to keep it going for a few more weeks, and then in a week's time we could have the president of a country that's been at the very least plausibly committing a genocide and whom arrest warrants are out by the ICJ and visiting Australia. So two aspects of my question.
Mm-hmm.
The first leaning towards your legal opinion about how that aligns with Australia's, if it does align with Australia's obligations under international law, for example, under the Rome Statute or as member nations of the ICC and the ICJ. And then from a political perspective of what are the risks associated if this ban does get extended by the Commissioner and the Minister and there's a ban on protests, could we see mayhem where people feel so strongly about this, like they did on the day of the Harbour Bridge protest, that they say, we're going to take action into our own hands?
So on the Herzog visit, under our domestic law, so under I think it's called the Foreign State Immunities Act, he's got head of state immunity, so he can't be arrested and charged in Australia. Under international law, I think the situation's quite different. In fact, I think under our international law obligations, I think it's at least strongly arguable that we have an obligation to investigate him if he's here. I say that because universal jurisdiction is here in our domestic legislation. There's a very strong international law argument that heads of state don't have head of state immunity in respect of genocide and other certain very serious crimes in the international legal order. So in terms of his conduct, there's been a UN commission that's found that he may well have incited genocide. He's made pretty well publicised statements along the lines of there's no innocence in Gaza, the people are responsible, they could have overthrown Hamas.
Yeah, a phrase that's probably slightly more violent than the Intifada phrase.
Well, it's also, and I actually had a read recently of that report and aspects of it. Some of the phrases that he used, and he's obviously a person in a position of particular and unique authority, some of those phrases were then picked up, used by Israeli soldiers in Gaza, spray painted apparently in different places, battle cries. Yeah. This is not unsurprising. He's the president. Now, in his defence, people say, well, in the same speech, he said that Israel complies with international law, et cetera, et cetera. People will give that the weight that they think it deserves, given that Israel doesn't have a good track record of complying with international law and often has its own unique interpretation of international law. I think his statements were clearly trying to obviate the distinction between civilian and combatant. They clearly seem to have some practical effect of inciting very serious crimes. The UN report that I read made a lot of sense to me. So that seems to be the legal position. We probably can't act against him here, but internationally we're probably obligated
to bring him?
Well, look, on the politics of it, I mean, to me, it's really a moral question. I don't think we've ever before invited to our country a head of state whose head of government is under an ICC indictment. I think the risk in bringing him here, and there's a number of them, but the immediate risk is it tends to give the impression that we don't take that seriously, that he's under ICC indictment. There is a clear suggestion of it's not a matter that troubles us enough to not have him here. All of that said, I take into account that many members of the Jewish community will say that it will be a benefit and a solace to people affected by Bondi. I take that very seriously. But on the other side of that equation, you've got to also take into account that there is a lot of Palestinians in Australia, for example. There's a lot of Gazans in Australia, some quite recently arrived, who've been the victims of that genocide. No doubt, many of them would say that they will be gravely affected by his presence. Now, the exercise of migration powers, if you want to look at it that way, often has really harsh and difficult consequences for people. So my personal opinion, for what it's worth, and I don't exercise these powers and I don't for a moment, pretend to understand the things that Albo's taking into account when he invites him, and he's got the burden of leadership in that respect. But I personally am pretty revolted by the prospect of this person being invited to Australia at this time in light of these ICC indictments from which that government protects the people the subject of the warrants. There's no cooperation with the ICC. There's very, very serious crimes alleged, and it tends to detract from the seriousness with which we credibly as a country can say that we take those matters.
Yeah, I think over the last, on that point, I think over the last year and a half, or maybe 2.5 almost, there's been a real discussion about the international rules-based order and whether Gaza has been a catalyst to the collapse, or at the very least the exposure of, the exposure of saying it's wielded very selectively. And there was a very interesting address by the Prime Minister of Canada about this last week, saying that there's a hypocrisy that's really been borne out over the last couple of years as to how it's wielded against, for example, third world countries versus allies of the United States or the Western powers. Do you think that visit and sort of what you're saying about it being a reflection of how seriously Australia takes its international obligations could contribute potentially to that perception within the community that, look, this is all a bit of a sham, because when push comes to shove, countries will always look after their allies?
I think it definitely sends that message, and it seems to be a sort of an event, an occurrence, this invitation. It obviously occurs in the particular context of Bondi, which is incredibly serious, but there's something about this that one can't help but think of it in the context of the Trump era and the eroding of international norms and liberal norms. I don't think we've ever invited a head of state to Australia in these circumstances. I don't think many comparable countries have had the Israeli president visit them in recent times. I know the UK, I think he visited last year, but don't think many European countries have had him visit since all this began.
Well, hopefully it's something that you can have a very strong say about in a caucus meeting if it ever comes to it.
Well, look, it's not a state issue, fundamentally.
That's right.
It's a federal issue. It's a federal issue. So, and as I said, look, I don't have the burden of leadership. It's easy for me to express my opinion, but you know, Albo's taking into account a range of things that I don't even understand.
For sure, well, I don't think you don't understand them. But what do you feel, or what do you think it says to the 300,000 that marched on the Harbour Bridge, to the thousands, if not millions at this point, that have protested over the last 2 years against the actions of Israel? What sort of message does this action send to them, coming from a Labour government which has a leader at its helm who is historically pro-Palestine?
Look, I think it goes back to what was said before about people are going to see an inconsistency in this, and they're going to see other reasons for it occurring. I mean, I give Albo the benefit of the doubt. I think he's placed a lot of weight on Bondi and the significance of the Israeli president visiting to members of the Jewish community. I accept that. There's other factors, I think, that people that marched on the Harbour Bridge are going to think is terribly important, including the fact that the ICJ found a plausible genocide and the ICC has issued arrest warrants for the head of government. And I think they would probably have the view that I have, which is inviting the Israeli president to Australia at this time tends to suggest, I'm not saying this is Albo's view, but it tends to suggest that we don't take those things to a certain degree of seriousness.
Does it go back? Does it say that Albo himself may be under a incredible amount of pressure to appease certain people? Just to be quite frank about it.
I don't think it does say that, to be honest. I mean, Albo recognised Palestine, and I know that the majority of the world did it about 30 years ago, but it's a significant step in Australia, and Albo hasn't hesitated to take various steps at different times. Again, I take him in good faith. He's done it because in his position of leadership, he's put particular weight on a particular thing. I respect that, but you know, I'm someone that, as I said at the beginning, I believe in the international legal system. I believe in human rights. I find it very difficult to understand this visit other than as something that sends a message that we don't take these things that seriously.
And so just to shift the burden for a moment, from Albo to the people, in your view, what can we as everyday citizens do to, I don't know if we're going to be able to stop this visit from happening, but what can we do to oppose it?
Express our
express
displeasure.
our displeasure.
Look, I think all of the tried and tested methods of political lobbying and protest and expression. You can write letters to MPs. You can attend protests. I know there's a couple scheduled.
They're not illegal now?
They're not illegal. I think
Well, they might be.
I'm pretty sure I thought I'm actually not sure about in terms of authorizations and so forth, but yeah, within the limits of the law, of course, you can attend protests, express your views, join groups that are advocating on the issue.
And not prescribed hate organisations.
Yeah,
also.
don't join prescribed hate. Well, there's none of them yet,
None
but
yet,
we don't know if there will be. But yeah, people need to use their voices, raise their voices. And that's what people have done in Australia in the last 3 years. And I think it's been terribly effective. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Do you think there's scope, and I know we're probably going over our time here, but do you think there's scope, just going back to my question earlier about if the bans are extended and so the protests become blanket, as long as they're not static and everything else, they become blanket prohibited, that we could see, hopefully it doesn't happen, but like riot-like situations, because everyone is prima facie committing an offence.
Yeah. Look, I've repeatedly said in Parliament pretty much since 2023 that I'm concerned that we are heading towards a 1978 Mardi Gras situation, that I'm concerned that as we apply police move-on powers to legitimate protests and demonstrations, which we disapplied in 1979, as we restrict the authorisation process, as we make of more full application prohibitions on road use, that we run the risk of an explosive situation. So yes, I'm concerned about that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm confident in the New South Wales Police. I'm confident that they'll manage things. But as always, and I said this at the time of the Harbour Bridge protest, it's critically important that politicians stay out of police operational decisions.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not a person there would be a lot of people in the New South Wales Police Force that wouldn't see me as some person, a particular ally of the police or whatever. Though I've actually got a lot of friends in the police force, and I think police do a really good job by and large.
Survived cross-examination and forgave you.
I've cross-examined a few, but I have consistently defended their operational decision-making at various protests since the 9th of October in part because as a criminal lawyer, and I'm sure you might have the same view, Majed, that you actually have some understanding from court cases you're involved in about how difficult street policing is.
Yeah.
So it's really easy after the event. Everyone says, those people should have been arrested, or you should have stopped those protesters. And it's like, easy for you to say that, but in the real world of operational policing, they're the guys and girls on the street at the time making decisions in real time. So they've got a really hard job. So when politicians sort of overlay it with politicised pressure and suggestions, this is not a commentary on the Herzog protest, but it can make their job more difficult. So
do you have a view that, or at least a view that you're able to share about whether it's both from a security and safety perspective and from a political perspective, whether it would be wise to extend the ban? I know I'm asking the question fresh off you saying you don't want to influence police decisions, but just noting, as a criminal lawyer and also someone who's done a lot of volunteer work with organisations helping people charge that protests, when I look at the prospect of the ban being extended and people attending protests, I think like mass arrests, lawyers having to do dozens of custody calls for otherwise law-abiding citizens who are not ordinarily in contact with the criminal justice system, and it really gives me cause to shudder. And I know a lot of colleagues of mine, particularly within the New South Wales Council of Civil Liberties and the New South Wales Legal Observers, feel the same, that we're really, really scared as to what could happen, how could this unfold, could people get hurt, could ordinary people have their lives ruined by...
Yeah, look, having just lectured everyone about the importance of not applying political pressure to police, look, I know they have disapplied the Public Assembly Restriction Declaration to most of Sydney, and that they've disapplied it to parts of the CBD. Look, what I hope would occur, and this is all subject to police making operational assessments, but what I would hope would occur would be that the state, broadly, that includes the police, would facilitate the holding of a very
Safe.
significant street procession
Yeah.
in a safe way so
Yeah.
that people can lawfully and peacefully express their views about the visit of the Israeli president. That's what I would expect.
And if anyone wants to hear more about your views, I believe there's somewhere they can listen to more of you.
That was
isn't
a
there,
brilliant
Stephen?
segue to my podcast, the Wigs podcast, which I went on another podcast recently and I didn't mention it and got in trouble from our host. I do have a podcast, the Wigs podcast. It's myself, Jim Minns, our host, Felicity Graham and Emmanuel Kirkasharian. Available, that's 3 barristers and Jim, who's a solicitor. And we talk about legal issues, human rights issues, political issues, and it's on like Spotify and all that sort of stuff.
We'll throw it in the
We'll throw a link into the
description,
comments.
and
Wonderful,
put
thank
a
you.
link in the comments as well.
It's amazing that you thought of that to raise that.
Oh, look, Stephen, especially it was more for Felicity's sake than yours. So special shout out to Felicity. We needed to keep her happy.
We love Felicity.
I totally forgot to mention that off the top of the podcast. I do apologize.
No,
for
not
that.
at all.
With that, it is quite late, so we will wrap up. Thank you for your time, Stephen.
No, thank you. Thank you to you both. It's been an
thanks
absolute
for
pleasure.
coming,
Really
Stephen.
interesting discussion.
Thank you again, Majed, for joining us.
Thanks for having me,
and
Bill.
Thank you, everybody who had joined us online, everybody who had asked a question and got involved in the conversation. The conversation sort of starts here, like as we like to say here. It's the first time I've said it here, but it does just start here. Please feel free to, continue the conversation in the comment section. Let us know your thoughts. Let us know what you thought of the conversation, and if we should have more of these sorts of deep dives into the legal process, and maybe we can get Stephen back on at some point.
Yeah, we were very lucky to have you. Thank you so
No,
much
it's
for your
been
time.
good.
Hopefully you
Much
didn't drive up
appreciated.
from Dubbo.
I flew from Dubbo this afternoon
Oh no.
and then got the train out from Parliament House, but I'm up here for a couple of things in the morning as well, so it's all good,
okay.
worked out.
Okay, so we didn't drive you.
No, not at all.
Keep you too late, basically. All right, so thank you again, everybody, and assalamu alaikum. We will see you in our next episode.
Salam.